Professor Swers, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Why don't we start with your background? Where did you start off, the arc of your career so far, and where you are now?
So I got into the field of political science through and the area that I study, which is women in Congress, because I had an internship while I was in college with the National Women's Political Caucus. And they were having at the time their 20th anniversary convention. And they were an organization that was created by several big women's movement activists, but it was a bipartisan organization that was focused on electing more women to Congress, both Republican and Democrat. And so as part of my internship, I was staffing their 20th anniversary convention, which meant I got to observe Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm. These were important figures in the women's movement. Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to Congress, and I got to carry her bags into her hotel room. So I followed her there and got to talk to her. I saw Bella Abzug speak and Geraldine Ferraro, who was the first female vice presidential candidate, Susan Molinari, who was a Republican congresswoman at the time from New York. And I was just very interested in the things that they were talking about and why they felt it was necessary to elect more women to Congress, that they would bring this different perspective. And they were looking at all levels of office. And so that left a big impression on me, that particular internship. After I graduated college, I became a high school teacher, but I had in the back of my mind that I might want to get a Ph.D. And I wanted to study women in Congress. And so in 1992, that was a huge election for women in Congress. People call that the year of the woman. And you had just enough women enter Congress to do some data analysis and not just anecdotal interviewing. So I kind of hit graduate school at the right time so that I could do a more nuanced study. And while I was in graduate school, I was also very influenced by a book that I know you've probably heard a lot about, which is Congress and the Electoral Connection by David Mayhew. And in that book, he argued that it really doesn't matter who you elect to Congress because all members of Congress need to serve their constituency. And so really it should not matter if I'm electing a Democrat, if I'm electing a male or a female Democrat. If I'm electing a Republican, a male or a female Republican should give me the same kind of representation because they need to represent their district's interests and what the district wants. And I thought, well, that made a lot of sense. But then I'm looking out into the real political world and I'm seeing that at this time, and this is before super PACs, Emily's List was a political action committee that was raising tons and tons of money specifically to elect female pro-choice Democratic candidates. And I thought, well, that's strange. Why would they spend all their time raising money to elect this particular group of candidates when under the Mayhew argument, a male Democratic pro-choice candidate should get you basically the same kind of representation. And they raised so much money that they were at the top of political action committees, right there tied with the National Rifle Association, which at that time was also one that would raise a lot of money. So that was sort of the question that got me into graduate school and led to my dissertation, was to try to unpack this idea of, does it make a difference in policy or other areas if you elect women or not, once you account for the things that we know predict congressional behavior, which are, your party affiliation, your ideology, your district characteristics. So these were all the kinds of questions that I was interested in coming into graduate school. And the fact that this 1992 election occurs at that same time, bringing in a whole new group of women into the House and Senate, sort of made it the ripe time for doing some data analysis of this kind of question. So that's how I get into the field. After I graduated Harvard in 2000, I spent 2 years teaching at Mary Washington College in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And then I moved over to Georgetown University, which is where I am now and have been for about the last 20 years.
Fantastic. So you talked about why specifically you focused on women. What brought you to the politics area in general, like the whole system? What was it that that drew you in even at an earlier age when you were working in that nonprofit sector?
So when I went to college, I was always interested in policy more than politics. So I did an internship with the Department of Health and Human Services. I worked on some policy there related to Head Start. So I was interested in issues related to children, related to families. And when I did the internship with the National Women's Political Caucus, I was interested in it from both more of a historical perspective and a policy perspective, even though the organization itself was a lot about politics and trying to encourage more women to run for office. And in fact, in that year, their keynote speaker for that conference was Bill Clinton, who at that time was the governor of Arkansas and was clearly, using this speaking engagement to, get the support of women's rights organizations. And that whole part I didn't really realize at all. And at the time I thought, wow, this guy's speech is really long and boring. So clearly I did not have my finger on the pulse of campaign politics. So it was better that I would go into the study of it and the study of policy.
Excellent. Well, let's go to the fundamental question you were asking, and just hit right on it in the beginning, if that makes sense. So your question seemed to be, is policy different when there are women versus when there are not? And I guess we can ask that question from the House perspective and the Senate. So why don't we start with the House and then move over to the Senate? What did you find?
Right. So my first book, The Difference Women Make, The Policy Impact of Women in Congress, was about the House. And so what I decided is, again, I was trying to figure out, do women focus more, are they advocating more for specific policy compared to men, once you account for the kind of district that you represent, your party affiliation, your ideology. So I decided, well, I'll just analyze through all the stages of policy development. So I looked at bill sponsorship, I looked at the bills they co-sponsor, I looked at the amendments they were offering in committee on specific legislation, I looked at the amendments they were offering on the floor. So I was basically following policy through the process. And what I found was your biggest differences occur in the agenda setting stage. So that women were more likely to devote resources to offering bills that were related somehow to women, children, and families. And you might divide these pieces of legislation into things that deal with social welfare issues, which are sort of traditionally associated with women, and then things that deal with feminist issues or issues that people consider to be more directed towards women, more women's rights oriented issues. And so you saw differences in both of those areas, particularly at that agenda setting stage. But it mattered if you were in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It mattered if you were in the majority party or the minority party. So for the Democratic women, they were particularly focused on women's rights issues. They focused on social welfare policy when Democrats were in the majority, which they were in the time period I was studying, which was the 103rd Congress, which was what was elected in 1992. But then there were no gender differences once you got to the 104th Congress among Democrats in the sponsorship of social welfare policy, because now they were in the minority and they didn't have access to that policy agenda. So they were still doing more women's rights policy. They were particularly upset and concerned about Republican efforts that they saw to restrict women's rights. And so they were very active in offering that kind of legislation, but they didn't do any more or any less than Democratic men when it came to social welfare policy once they were in the minority party and could not set the agenda since they were not majority party members. For Republican women, when they got the majority, they also, though, were more likely to be active on social welfare policy. So they did not do more when they were in the minority in the 103rd Congress. They did do more when they were in the majority party in the 104th. They did less on the feminist type policies when they get into the majority party, because the Republican Party, that was not the focus of their agenda. Those were considered Democrat issues. And so if you wanted your colleagues to advance any number of legislation that you had on various types of policy areas that were good for your district or important priorities of yours, you wouldn't want to upset them by pushing feminist legislation that was not going to go anywhere. So they did less of the feminist policy when they were in the majority than they had done when they were in the minority. They did more of the social welfare policy when they were in the majority. So that's kind of the main difference I found sort of in the sponsorship area. And then generally, it is the case that women act as spokespersons on these particular issues related to women because other members consider them to have moral authority on these issues. They make better spokespeople to the public when you're trying to sell an issue or something like that. And we still see that to this day. So when they talk about Violence Against Women Act, it's usually the female members on both sides that they have out there speaking to the public, acting as the advocates for particular policy areas. Abortion policy, of course, is an area that is very much discussed within Congress and will be even more shortly when you get the Supreme Court decision.
So how about on the Senate side?
So on the Senate side, I did another study where what I wanted to know there, so whereas on the House side, I basically followed legislation through the different phases. On the Senate side, I wanted to focus more on, as a senator, I have the responsibility for an entire state. So would that mean that there's going to be less difference among senators because everybody's got a lot to do being focused on an entire state, but I also have more leeway as an individual. In the House, your policy agenda is very focused on what is your committee assignment. And you can't really, as one of 435, influence a lot of areas outside of that committee assignment. But in the Senate, they get multiple committee assignments. And they can theoretically command more media attention and influence policy on a wider variety of things. So I wanted to see then, as a senator, would gender have more of an effect? Because now I can pursue policy interests in these areas if I want to in more areas, or should I see less of an effect because I have so much responsibility as one senator for the entire state? Maybe, my plate is too full. And what I generally saw was that, again, the women members were more interested in putting issues related to women, children, and family onto their policy agenda. So they would do more on these things. And some of that comes from their personal background, their lived experience. Some of that comes from the expectation of constituents or interest groups that thought that the women might be more approachable on a certain subject. So when it came to issues related to things like sexual assault in the military, some of the advocacy groups would say, well, they expected that at that time, Kay Bailey Hutchison of Texas, that she might be more willing to meet with them, right, than maybe a male Republican on the committee or something like that. So it's a combination of their own interests, the expectation of constituents, the expectation of advocacy groups that led them to do more in this policy area. But then I also wanted to look outside of the issues of women's rights and see, are there other differences when it comes to other responsibilities that senators have? So I looked at defense policy because at the time that I was studying was the time of the Iraq War. And there's this view that women are more pacifists, which possibly comes from the fact that Jeanette Rankin was the first female member of Congress, and she voted against both entry into World War I and World War II. So women get a reputation as pacifists. But what I found was actually that was not the case. So when you looked at the voting on the Iraq War, it was entirely determined by the members' ideology and really had nothing to do with their gender. And women were not less expert. So there is this notion that Democrats are less expert than Republicans. The issue is more of a Republican-owned issue, national security. And then that might be compounded if you're a Democratic woman because it's thought that women are less expert on military issues than men. But I found that men and women were equally active, and that actually what goes on in the Senate is they are a lot more focused on how military policy impacts their state than you might first think. So of course, everyone is interested in particular large questions, say today of Ukraine, but they're also very interested in Are you considering closing the base in my state? Will you want to invest more funding in aircraft carriers, let's say, or some type of shipbuilding? So I live in the state of Virginia. So here our senators will support more ships, more shipbuilding, because we have Newport News and these bases and areas. So there's actually a lot of constituency focus in what they do related to the military. But the one area where I did find difference was that the female members were more likely to support and advocate for social welfare type policies related to the military. So more veterans benefits, more money to support the education of people in the military, or childcare benefits for military families. So those type of supports to help military families, you are more likely to see female senators getting on than the male senators, even though, of course, many do support these types of proposals. So that's what I found in the area of defense policy. And then the third area that I looked at was the area of judicial nominations. And at this time, I was looking at, would gender matter in whether you supported Supreme Court nominees? Because Supreme Court nominees are really important to your party's president. So therefore, as a member, I should always support my president's nominees, regardless of any particular issues surrounding the nominee. So I was looking at the most gendered of nominations at that time, which was the replacement of Sandra Day O'Connor. So Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman on the Supreme Court. And when she retired, George W. Bush needed to find a replacement, and there was a lot of pressure on him to replace her with a female nominee. He ultimately attempted that with a woman named Harriet Miers, who he then ends up withdrawing later because various conservative judicial organizations didn't feel she was going to be conservative enough. They weren't sure about her track record. So he ultimately withdraws her nomination and settles on someone else. So then we have Justice Roberts and Justice Alito being nominated in this time period. And what I wanted to know was, and I should say that Justice Rehnquist passed away, so then Justice Roberts becomes the nominee for the Chief Justice, and Justice Alito is the Sandra Day O'Connor replacement. And it's a particularly interesting one because Sandra Day O'Connor was a pivotal vote in an abortion case that was fairly well known, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where she kind of helps create this idea of an undue burden standard as to how you regulate abortion and when state legislatures could adopt new restrictions. And Justice Alito had been on the circuit court that also heard that case, and he made an opposite decision than she. So he was more supportive of restrictions than she was. So I wanted to look at, do the members get involved in terms of their votes? Do they vote differently? And then what issues do they say are determinative of their vote? So all the senators will make floor speeches and talk about why they can or they can't support a particular nominee. And what I found generally was, if you were a Republican, you needed to support the president's nominee. So even if Olympia Snowe at the time was a Republican from Maine, and so was Susan Collins, even if the two of them were voting against, at that time, legislation to ban partial birth abortion, they were going to vote in support of the Supreme Court nominees. And that would be because it is more important to support your party's president's nominee. You will not be thanked by the opposite side for voting against, but you will be condemned by your own party and lose support and lose fundraising. So they supported Alito and Roberts. And then I wanted to look at the Democratic side to see what would be determinative of those votes. So Alito was pretty uniformly opposed by Democrats, and that's largely because he was replacing a swing justice. And Roberts, the support was divided. So he was replacing Rehnquist, so you weren't moving the ideological balance of the court, but it was divided, and gender did have some effect. The women were a bit less likely to support him than the men. And there was a difference in what they would say were the reasons. So we know that Roe versus Wade has long been a litmus test. And so generally every Democrat might make some reference to that. But the Democratic women would go beyond the issue of abortion when they were talking about Alito's records and Roberts' records, and they would reference other cases and other issues that they had decided related to family leave policy, related to the concept of pay equity, Title IX, jurisprudence, these kinds of things. So they incorporated more issues related to women and families in their reasoning as to why they were opposing than some of the men talking about why they were opposing. So one thing maybe that some of the men might have focused on a little bit more was the idea of executive authority and having too expansive of a view of executive power and things like that. So that whole issue, of course, continues to today. So when people were looking at why Susan Collins supported Brett Kavanaugh, for example, if you look back at this research, you can see that, she should have been expected to support Brett Kavanaugh because that was the nominee for her party's president.
So it sounds like the policy differences you've seen on the Senate and the House side were all related to women's and children's issues or family issues. And in terms of what made them go into those policy areas could have been their own personal points of view, or they came in with those agendas potentially, or that point of view. It could have been maybe they were elected in part because of their views, right? That played into their election. Or the third area you mentioned is they could have been more a target of special interests that related to those issues, since those special interests assumed that they were a shortlist target for those kind of ideas. So in those three areas, when you kind of went through them, is there anything that was like a smoking gun for any of those areas, or is it always kind of a mix of these things that are very hard to untangle?
So I do think it's hard to untangle. I would say that probably at the base, it's more likely that their own personal life experience is what's important, because that's what makes them open and responsive to the pleas of others. So if I have personal life experience with something, I'm more likely to consider it to be an issue, more likely to dedicate political time and capital to it. Anything that I do, there's an opportunity cost because I'm losing the opportunity to do something else. So I think that at base, the life experience is very important, because if you've had experience with a certain issue, if you've had, say, difficulty finding childcare or any other number of issues, then you're more open to the idea that there needs to be legislating about it. And so I think that a lot of these women were already, based on life experience, more open to it. You can see that in something like the Affordable Care Act, when they were negotiating the benefits package there. And during that negotiation, there was discussion about what had to be included, because the more I include, the more expensive, right, the package is going to be. But there are certain things that you wanted to have covered. And so there was discussion about whether, for example, pregnancy should be covered as a benefit that was a basic benefit that insurance companies had to offer. And so there was a little bit of a tussle between Debbie Stabenow, who was pushing for it, and John Kyle, who was Republican from Arizona, who was pushing back against it. She had her viral moment where he said, I'm never going to need this as a man. And she said, well, but she bets that his mother did, right? So I think that for many of the women who had this experience of in their own life, going through pregnancy or other sort of issues that women face, or the knowledge that women were charged at that time more for insurance than men because pregnancy is expensive, then it was more important to them. So it's also like what you're willing to give away to. So sometimes it's not that I'm adding something in, but that I'm less willing to give way on a particular issue, and say when something, we have a limited budget, when something's on the chopping block, I'm more likely to advocate to say, well, this thing has to be kept, right? And if I have personal experience with it, then this is what I want to be kept. in the very recent negotiations over the gun control bill, where you had Senator Cornyn and Senator Tillis and Senator Sinema and Senator Murphy, most of the reporting showed that it was Senator Sinema that was bringing forth the idea of wanting to include something to close what they call the boyfriend loophole related to domestic violence and whether people could get access to a gun. So this is just sort of another example of the idea that, she might be more open, right, to that kind of question and decide to make it a priority as opposed to any number of other issues. And, that was an area where, this will be the first, if it passes, the first bill in 30 years to pass related to gun legislation. So it's a very difficult issue for members of Congress. So I think having her at the negotiating table, right, made the outcome different than perhaps had she not been there.
And you didn't see any sort of unrelated policy differences between men and women, it sounds like, unrelated to the family aspect or the women's aspect or the children's aspect, whether it's some random part of the regulatory regime or some non-related area. You didn't see any kind of differences in terms of policy outlook.
So in my House study, I was focused specifically on these types of issues, and I divided them into sort of social welfare policy that would be healthcare, education, that maybe you would expect all members to care about, right? All members care about the quality of schools in their district. And then the ones that were really more targeted at women themselves. So something like a question of pay equity, right, would be much more targeted at women. So I did not look at, say, agriculture policy to see if women were more likely to promote for soybeans versus wheat or something like that. And I imagine that's a very constituency focused question. The only area where there might have been some difference in terms of agriculture policy is, of course, the Agriculture Committee also deals with SNAP benefits, which is, your food stamp programs and school lunch and things like that. And that would have been incorporated for me into social welfare policy. And there was some difference on that when they were in the majority party. When I did my Senate study, I did broaden out, right? And so, as I mentioned, when you looked at defense policy, women were not, it's thought that women would be more pacifist, but women were not more pacifist. They were the same as men. And a lot of this was determined by what kind of state did they represent and, what kind of military bases were there or what kind of defense contractors. So very constituency oriented in terms of, what drives jobs in a particular state.
So what about the non-policy related behavior in Congress? So for instance, the Senate putting holds on people or filibustering, or I don't know, 5-minute speeches in the House, and are they different in nature than the men? Are there other kinds of differences that you've seen that would, allow you to figure out, guess that it would be a woman versus a man when you look at the some kind of deliverable of Congress, whether it be some procedural activity or some kind of information created by the member?
So there is sort of a large literature about whether or not women are more consensus oriented. So in the literature of psychology, women are more consensus oriented, they're less confrontational, they're less aggressive. And so there is some thought that if you had more women in Congress, maybe they would want to behave in a more consensus oriented or more bipartisan.
But that's only if those kinds of women get elected, right?
Exactly. So there have been some studies of state legislatures that have found that women have been more consensus oriented, but these are more in the early 1990s, and I don't think they are as much today. And we're in a very partisan period. So I think the more partisan and the more polarized Congress gets, the more that you need to show yourself to be a partisan fighter to get elected in the first place. So that really reduces the incentive and the sort of the room for this idea that women are more consensus oriented. There are certain indicators. So in the Senate, the women are known to have bipartisan dinners with each other on a regular basis. You have certain women that have been the center of Senate gangs. So we just mentioned Kristen Sinema being in a gang, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are regularly members of these gangs that try to negotiate policy. And it might have something to do with their gender, but it also probably has a lot to do with the fact that they are ideologically at the center of the Senate, right? So they are the moderates. And so maybe, some of it relates to gender, but a lot probably also relates to where they are sort of ideologically positioned within the Senate.
Right. And, on the program earlier, we talked to Professor Volden and Weissman, and I think they did some analysis about the effectiveness or basically getting your legislation into law and the probability of that and how successful you are at that. And I think they found that that women, when they were in the minority, had a better chance of getting something through. And they chalked it up potentially to the issue you just mentioned. So I'm curious what your opinion is on their data and whether you think that makes sense.
So I know they do have a finding where they studied what they call legislative effectiveness in terms of how productive members of Congress are, and that women were more likely to get action on their bills when they were minority party members. Now, in general, minority party members are less likely to get action on their bills. So you're talking about in a group of people who are less likely to see action on their bills, women were more likely to get some action. And so they attribute that to this idea that women might be more consensus oriented. And so therefore they would be willing to work across the aisle in order to see some of their goals met. And you certainly hear sort of anecdotal evidence that way, that a member might say that they would, let the other person be the lead sponsor or something like this on their idea because they just want to see the bill pass. And certainly in the earlier years, when women had much less seniority, I think you probably would see more of that, even when they were maybe in the majority, because when it comes to something like the Violence Against Women Act, right, we know that President Biden considers that to be his signature legislation, as well as Chuck Schumer, who was on the House side. And that's because President Biden was chairman of the Judiciary Committee when that passed in the Senate. And Chuck Schumer was chairman of the Subcommittee on Crime when that passed in the House. So the women that would want something to be passed would need to get it by them and get their buy-in, get something into what you call the chairman's mark when it gets marked up. So maybe you can't take personal credit because now it's in the chairman's mark. So it's the chairman's credit, but now it's in the bill, right? And so now it's passed. So in that way, you might have seen I would say even more probably in the early 90s than you see today, perhaps women being more effective there. The other side of that coin is they find in their study that women were less effective in the majority as Congress gets more partisan and polarized, because that willingness to fight is more valued in current times.
Right. So what about in the leadership positions? So, you have some data, I guess, at this point, in terms of committee chairs or in terms of Speaker of the House. What is your, whips, et cetera? What are there any differences in leadership style between men and women when they're in either chamber?
So in terms of the committees and the committee chairs, I think you do see for the Democratic women committee chairs, because it's more Democrats that have reached the level of seniority to be able to get the committee chairs. So you have more Democratic women who've been chairs. And when right now you have Rosa DeLauro, who is the chair of the Appropriations Committee in the House. Kay Granger is her ranking member. And on the part of Rosa DeLauro, she has been very active on pushing the child tax credit, on pushing pay equity, on pushing a lot of issues related to women, children, and families, and prioritizing those issues, which she can do as the chair. So the advantage to being the chair is I control the hearings, I have the chairman's mark, right? So my policy priorities are the committee's priorities. So in that way, there are some cases where you've seen some women utilize their chairmanship to push some of these kinds of issues. In terms of the party leadership, there have been really very few women who've reached the highest echelons of party leadership. So people might not realize that because Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. And so everybody focuses on Nancy Pelosi. And she certainly has made these issues as her mantra. She always talks about everything is for the children. So she certainly makes these issues a priority. But in terms of leadership style, as you were discussing before, she is a consensus builder within her caucus. She knows where everybody is, and she's very good at keeping track of people's needs. But I'm certain that Republicans would not describe her as a consensus builder. She very much shuts them out. She's been described to be more, her leadership style, more similar to Newt Gingrich, the very famous Republican speaker, than to Tom Foley, who would have been the previous Democratic speaker in terms of her leadership style and her level of partisanship. Below that, the highest women have gotten in the party leadership structure is conference chair. So on the Republican side, several women have become the conference chair. You had Kathy McMorris Rogers, Liz Cheney, and then now Elise Stefanik have all been conference chair. So is Deborah Price from Ohio. And, that's a party messaging position. They're helping to craft the message of the party, but it's not a policy leadership position as much. So those things are really kept more to the speaker, the majority leader, the whip.
Got it. In terms of how they get there in the first place, can we talk a little bit about your perspective on the election side? What do you see there and how does it impact on the women in Congress?
So there's a lot of work about the fact that women are less likely to run for Congress than men. The literature is called Political Ambition. It's associated with Jennifer Lawless at University of Virginia and some others. And in that literature, what they find is that women who are in similar sort of positions to men in the business world and the legal field are just less likely to throw their hat in the ring. They're less likely to feel themselves qualified to run for office. So that means women have to be asked more. And so that's part of why we see fewer women in office. And then there has been a large amount of study looking at other barriers. Besides
maybe they're smarter. It's crazy to run for office these days.
Yes, it's very expensive. And you have to be willing to subject yourself to,
the suffering.
Yeah. So the other side of the literature in terms of looking at electing women is about fundraising, because if I want to run for Congress, I need, somewhere north of $2 million for a House seat. I need multiple millions if I want to win a Senate seat. That's pretty daunting for anyone. And so when we look at the fundraising on the Democratic side, they built more of a fundraising apparatus to elect women earlier. So you had Emily's List, which was for electing pro-choice Democratic women. It's a huge organization. And then you've had other groups that have come up since. And you've had some women who led the House and Senate Democratic campaign committees who were particularly devoted to electing more women and campaigning for women. More recently, you see this on the Republican side. So on the Republican side, Elise Stefanik particularly has been very engaged in trying to elect more Republican women to Congress. They have a few organizations outside PACs that are dedicated to that, but they're nowhere on the size and scope of an Emily's List. And part of that is because the Republican electorate is not as responsive to saying that you need to elect more women particularly. So it's really very recent that they've done more of this. So in research that I've done with Karen Kitchens and with Danielle Thompson, we were looking at what kind of women can get elected. Sort of to your question before, are you going to be more consensus oriented? Only if a consensus oriented person can get elected, right? So what we find in terms of who can get elected, when we're looking particularly in the primary races where I have to really build my own coalition, it's much more likely that Democratic women can raise the money than Republican women could. And among donors, Democratic female donors were very interested in electing more women over and above the things that you would expect. So things like is this a competitive race? Is this a quality candidate, which is generally measured as have they run for previous office? Democratic women would support Democratic female candidates with their donations, over and above that. However, more donors are men than women. But what we see is that the Democratic women actually raised more money in the primary. It did not translate into any difference in electoral outcomes. So Democratic women were not more likely to win, but they raised more money overall than Democratic men. Republican women and Republican men, generally there wasn't a difference in their ability to fundraise, except when you looked at what we call those quality candidates who were challengers in open seats. So the people who had run for previous office. Then there was a difference where Republican women were raising less than Republican men, which is probably why Elise Stefanik and EPAC and these other organizations are focused on trying to help more of these Republican women raise the money to win a Republican primary so that they can get more women into office. But these days I need to be, somebody who conforms to what the party's primary electorate is looking for. That's the type of candidate that's going to get elected.
So it sounds like it's primarily ideology driven with a little bit of flavor of, on the Democrat side, women might be more likely to support women.
Yes. So on the Democratic side, women are a little more likely to support women, but they want liberal women. They don't want, moderate and conservative women, particularly when you're looking at individual donors. So individual donors, they donate because they want to see candidates who agree with them more on policy. That's why they donate, as opposed to a political action committee that might donate if I'm a particular corporate PAC. I'm donating because I have business in front of this committee, and if you're on this committee, I'm going to donate to you because I want you to think positively towards me. So I'm a little less ideologically driven and a little more, pragmatically driven about who's on the committee seats.
And on the Republican side, the high quality candidates you mentioned who are women who didn't raise as much money as comparable men. What do you think the reasoning is behind that? Just it's a perception about what they did in office before? Is it unexplainable, or what do you think the driving factor is there?
Yeah, so it's hard to know without doing interviews, but some of the ideas that have been sort of floated are that people generally have an idea that women are more liberal because particularly Democratic women are more prominently covered in the media. And if I'm perceived as more liberal as a Republican, that might help me in the general election, but it certainly will not help me in the primary election. Where they want to have the more conservative candidate. So if a Republican woman needs to spend more time proving her conservative credentials, or now, proving that she's a fighter, that might be something that would, contribute to it being more difficult.
Great. Well, I think it's time for us to move on to phase 2 of our discussion, where I ask questions that I've asked all of our guests. If you're ready for the next phase, shall we move on?
Yes.
The first one here, I think, is quite interesting. It goes back to the beginning of our conversation on the concept of representation and back to Mayhew. So, what do you think congressional representation should mean? Is it everybody in the district? Should there be extra attention to certain groups that you might identify with? Is it the current constituents? Is it future constituents? What does representation mean, or should it mean?
So I really like an article by Jane Mansbridge called Rethinking Representation, where she talks about the different ways that we think about representation. So of course, people think about, delegates and trustees and things like this, but she also talks about that the traditional model is something called promissory representation. A member makes a promise and then the constituents judge it in the next election. But she says that there's also these other ideas. Anticipatory representation, where I'm actually, as the member, I'm looking towards pleasing the constituents in the next election, not the promises I made in the last election. Gyroscopic representation, which is I tell you that you and I share values, and that's why you should elect me, because we share values. And I think that one is probably more realistic about how voters generally think. I don't think they're sitting around studying policy positions. And then she also talks about surrogate representation, which is I'm standing in for a group. So that might be I'm standing in for if we've been talking about women, it might be that, women across the country could also come to a female representative and, hope that she might represent their interests. But what I find particularly interesting about this whole idea is I think it's very important that members represent constituents, but I also think it's very important, this idea of interests versus preferences and how members go about explaining what they're doing and deliberating. So I think the idea of the promissory, the anticipatory representative that she talks about makes space for the deliberation between the member and the constituent. And Richard Fenno talked about this as building trust. How do I build trust with my constituents so that they would give me leeway for taking difficult votes? So I think that the members are elected to represent the interests of the district, and they should do that. But they have to be able to discern what are the interests versus current preferences. And then they have to be able to both be educated by the constituents and educate the constituents on what they are learning about policy and about issues as a member of Congress who is elected, to take decisions for the constituents that the constituents can't vote on themselves.
But it sounds like that you take you take the view that members make judgments, right, and make judgments about what the interests of their constituents are, and you take that notion seriously as a point of representation. Is that right?
Yes, because I think that the member needs to consult broadly to find out what the constituents' concerns and interests are. So they need the fact that they're elected from a district and not just elected nationally means that they should be, taking into account and understanding the needs of their district and the interests of their constituents. But then also the fact that they are there, learning from experts studying policy, they should be bringing that knowledge back to the constituents and engaging in dialogue with the constituents to convince them as to why they voted a certain way and why the constituents should be supportive of that.
And when you say the word constituents, it sounds like you're implying everybody in a district or everybody in a state versus a narrower conception of that interest. Is that, or that constituency? Is that right?
Right. So, Richard Fenno, of course, has the idea of the concentric circles, and your largest is the geographic constituency. And I think ideally, the members should at least be speaking to the geographic constituency. Obviously, they're going to get more support from their reelection constituency. Nobody's going to be able to please all comers, but you should be willing to engage with all comers and be trying to take the pulse of and get an understanding of the different parts of your constituency.
Great. So next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And this is more about how much time in DC versus back in the home district, and while they're in DC, what should they be doing with what proportions of their time?
So I think that it would be beneficial for Congress to spend more time on policy in general, whether that is within Congress or in the district. So in general, I think that there's too much time spent on fundraising and too much time spent on messaging and social media and these kinds of things. And Frances Lee has a very important book called Insecure Majorities. And one thing that struck me in that book is she shows how the leadership staff has increased related to the media and the messaging staff, and the policy-oriented staff has declined. So I think on the whole, if I could change things, I would focus more on Congress beefing up its policy-making abilities and focusing more on the policy-making aspect and the oversight aspect of Congress, and a little less on the messaging and the fundraising aspect of Congress.
So do you have like a preference, 1 week on, 1 week off, or 2 weeks on in DC, 1 week off, or 3, 2? Do you have a favorite?
So I can't say that I have a favorite in terms of that organization, because especially now that we're in the hybrid world, you can do more remotely. So I think, you could do a policy-oriented committee hearing in someone's district within the committee. and you would be focused on policy, and you would be learning about that district. And I would see that as a very good use of time. Logistically, it's probably generally easier if you spend a concentrated period in DC as opposed to, coming in, flying in Monday, Tuesday, going home Thursday. So that probably would work better for policy orientation. But I think generally the big issue right now is that you have an ethos where you need to change the norms of Congress to value the policymaking side more, because there's a general feeling that Washington is a swamp, right? It's described as a swamp, and that's the place where policymaking goes on. So if the member wants to get reelected, they want to show themselves as apart from the swamp, and this is a long-standing growing issue. So back in the 1980s, Morris Fiorina was writing about the fact that members of Congress win by running against the institution, and so was Richard Fenno. So as long as I'm taking it as a point of pride that I sleep in my office and I don't have a home here, and I'm apart, right? I have values that are, wherever I'm from values and not Washington, D.C. values. I think you need to realign that to make it okay to spend your time working on policy and spend less of your time going on, cable news channels and things like that.
Next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? Are you a committee person? You think they should have that? Should they be behind closed doors sometimes with some privacy, or should everything be transparent? Should we have more floor debate? Where do you see this happening?
So if you're trying to make policy, I think it would be beneficial for more work to get done in committees than is currently done, so that you would have more voices involved in the process, and so that you encourage the development of expertise within a committee, that you want to incentivize members of the committee to develop policy expertise with the idea that they will have a chance to influence policy in that area, which they get less of if it's all being taken out and put towards the leadership. In terms of the making of policy, because everything is so transparent these days and covered, when policy really happens, it does seem to happen behind the closed doors. So either in a gang in the Senate or in negotiations among party leadership and the president, and it's all very, hush hush, and nobody knows anything until a final package is released. So I think that in the current climate, being so partisan and polarized, there needs to be more spaces for members to deliberate behind closed doors, as nice as it is for the public and researchers to have things to count and observe. It would probably be beneficial for there to be more deliberation done in private if you want to achieve policy results.
Great. Next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
So as you can see, since I'm focused on the policy side, I think there should be more investment in beefing up congressional policy chops. And so that would be things like putting more investment into the Congressional Research Service, the Congressional Budget Office, perhaps restarting the Office of Technology Assessment, since technology is so very important now, putting more investment into congressional staff, both in terms of how much you pay staff so that they don't decide that they want to go off into the various sort of private sector worlds that pay much more, in terms of how you support them and provide them with training, but also in an effort to broaden out the type of people that you are able to hire as staff. So I think it would be beneficial for Congress to be recruiting policy staff in their districts, to be recruiting staff from a wider variety of backgrounds. Right now, it's very much sort of a who you know kind of an atmosphere, and so if you were able to broaden out in terms of where you recruit for staff, paying the interns, which I know that they're trying to do in a lot of cases, because not everybody can afford. Washington, D.C. is extremely expensive to come and work for free in the summer, and if that's a stepping stone to then getting a position. So I think trying to do things to support staff development to support staff expertise would be very beneficial. Similarly, in electing members of Congress, there's a lot of work by Nicholas Carnes on how to get more people to be able to run from working class backgrounds, to not have to be able to self-fund. And in terms of women, there's an organization called Vote Mama that's trying to get more women with young children to get elected by trying to get legislatures to pass the ability to use your campaign money for childcare. So not every state allows that. So some of these kinds of reforms could actually have an impact on the type of person who's willing to put their hat in the ring, which, you know, could then impact who's running for office. And if you're there to do policy, or if you're there to, you know, be more of a message-oriented media star.
Right. Next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
So I think I mentioned it. I would say Frances Lee's Insecure Majorities, because she points out how competitiveness we generally think of as only a good. So when we talk about redistricting reform, people will talk about the fact that that redistricting has made it so that elections are less competitive, right? And that's a bad thing if someone is secure in their district. But the downside to competitiveness as an aggregate institution is that if the majority and the minority party see the possibility of winning the majority in the next election all the time, then they never have any incentive to cooperate with each other. And that it's created an incentive structure where messaging becomes more important. And so she points out that you have more staff devoted to messaging than to policy, more party-oriented staff, that the nature of the Senate and the mending behavior on the Senate floor has changed so that there are more messaging amendments that they expect to lose on than amendments where you're really trying to pass them to influence policy. So that sort of aspect of how the larger political sphere has changed has had real effects on how policy, you know, behavior occurs. And so I think that it's important to keep that in mind with any kind of reform that we're trying to implement.
Great. Well, the last question is really about your research in the future. What do you have on the horizon, and what do you where do you see your research going in the long run?
So I like to research about policy activity and how different combinations of members affect policy activity. And so I'm very focused right now on the Republican Party and Republican women, because the parties, as they've polarized and the Republican Party has become more conservative, Republican women have really changed the most among members. So in the early 90s, a lot of the Republican women were much more moderate from northeastern states or from Ohio and the Midwest. And now the Republican Party's sort of center of focus is the South and the West. And a lot of those women that are being elected are much more conservative. And so I'm very interested to know how that change then affects the type of policies that these women are advocating for, and then their ability to succeed within the caucus. So I'm doing some work right now with Danielle Thompson looking at bill sponsorship from the early 90s up to today. And we're finding that the more moderate women were certainly much more focused on the things that we've talked about related to women's rights or policy related to children and families. But that even in these current times where you have more conservative women, that they do offer policy in this area, not as much as the moderate Republican women did, but they do offer more policy in this area. And they're more likely to have success than the moderate women did, because they are closer to the center of their caucus in terms of, you know, what the caucus is going to support in policy. So I'm very interested in generally looking at sort of that interrelationship between gender, party, partisanship, and ideology. And so that's where my research focus is right now.
Excellent. Well, Professor Swers, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck with coming work.
Thank you very much for having me.